Thank you, Mark. And speaking of connections, I also value so much the team here at South by, of course. They do an amazing job. I'm much of an introvert, so coming into the room, having that team, so please give them a round of applause. Thank you. It makes life so much easier for all of us. So with that note, as I talk to my students, I try to remind them that when we're in the room talking about games, we're not just talking about the mechanics or the economics per se. What we're really talking about is a larger cultural phenomenon. I have students from all over the world in my classroom, and what I like about that is that I will have someone studying finance and accounting, and I have someone studying press and marketing communications, and someone studying game design, all in the same room, all trying to express and share their ideas about how they came up and grew up with video games and what that meant to them. And the invitation is always the same, is that by show of hands, who knows Pokemon? Who knows the games that we played as a child, as a kid growing up? Did you play Club Penguin back in the day? And in my mind, yes, there's always a fan. And in my mind, it's that kind of commonality that is so wonderful about the games industry that makes it uniquely global and uniquely exciting. And so for that reason, I will give you the same advice I give all of my students. Make a friend today. Some of you will be more introverted than others. It's okay. There's no shame in it. Really find that connection, which I believe today is more critical than ever. So let's begin. I'm here to talk to you today about the industry of games. The video games industry as I know it, as I've studied it over the last 20 years. And I want to share with you sort of my annual update as to what that looks like. This is now my 5th time here at South by. It's an incredible honor every year, of course. And what it means to me is a chance to kind of give you a sense of my ideas, how I see the world, what I've learned over the last year, and then getting some of your feedback. So I invite you, of course, also to use the tool to ask questions at the end and to come up to the stage, come to the book signing later, and talk some more. The fundamental question, of course, that starts us off is, what is the state of play? Where are we in the games industry? And if you were to use conventional wisdom, if you were to trust and believe what's out there, it looks something like this. The state of play after an incredible run-up has resulted in this just house burning down, this metaphor of a playground on fire, which is actually taken from the fires on the West Coast not too long ago. It describes in my mind so well the narrative that's being kicked around in the industry when it comes to one of the most formidable entertainment industries, one of the largest environments for just sharing and communicating and connecting with others. And somehow we're made to believe that these things are now just lit up like a torch and eventually going to die like we've seen before. The games industry comes from a place where the toy industry informed much of its economics, but also its marketing narrative around it. And so as a hula hoop or as roller skates go, the games industry is under this constant threat by investors, shareholders, analysts, and a myriad of other companies that will tell you, oh, it's a fad, it's dead now, it's over. And so I want to go against conventional wisdom a little bit. I want to tell you a little bit about how we got here. What is going to sort of continue in the next foreseeable future and how that narrative expands from there, and what ultimately we can expect down the line and if there is some kind of solution for this. I don't want to spoil it, but ultimately, of course, you can probably already tell I disagree with this narrative entirely, but I'm going to make the case to all of you today to see if there is some merit to it and if I can get you along on that ride. So first things first, where are we in all this? The games industry has seen a 20-year period of just spectacular growth. Part of the reason I'm in the room, and perhaps many of you, is that the games industry in video games as a phenomenon came out of nowhere and suddenly finds itself at the foreground of all these conversations, of all these publishers, all these creative industries, all these developers looking into this category saying, hey, this is a fun thing to do. I grew up with this. I want to make better games. I want to make more games. I want to make games that really inspire people in many, many different ways. Not just, of course, the endemics, it's also the non-endemics, it's the music companies of the world, it's brand holders, it's IP holders, all of them have eventually seceded and say, you know what, we should be in this market right now. But after a period of all this growth, we see now in the last few years some decline. I think it's not really that big of a deal if you've been growing 700% or so and then suddenly decline 7%, but hey, I'm not a shareholder in that sense. What you see though at the high level is some really very public and very painful failures. Sony PlayStation, launched recently a game called Concord, a first-person shooter game that sort of looks and feels and walks and talks like Overwatch, if you know that one, and it bombed horribly. My estimation was they spent about $250 million on the whole thing over a period of 6 years. Within days of the launch, they took it off the market, refunded everybody, and shut the whole thing down and laid everybody off. And it's a catastrophic moment which sets the tone for much of the industry. X-Defiant, a shooter game that emulates Apex Legends, made by Ubisoft, same thing. After initially having about 200,000 concurrent players, very quickly did it just fall apart in a very sort of sad way, because it wasn't a bad game so much as that it needed some more love and caring post-release. And the problem now is that Ubisoft, unlike PlayStation in this sense, finds itself at the business end, right? As this game fails, it raises a lot of questions with regards to its ability to continue as a formidable, as a first and very prominent French publisher out there in Europe as one of the 3 largest ones in the region. Like, how's that gonna go? If one of those companies can't even succeed in this environment, what's to say for everything else? And part of the problem in this sense is that ever since, say, the last 10, 15 years, we've seen a massive increase in expenditure. The cost of development for games, here we see an early version of Call of Duty. Here's the most recent one. It's a very good one for the fans, but the expenditure behind it is substantial. You see this 10x increase of what it used to cost to make a blockbuster AAA title compared to today. Not just the development cost, also marketing has been incredibly expensive. When it comes to mobile games in particular, we see this saturated market. We see an environment in which, of course, established IP will do really, really well. At the same time, things like Monopoly Go make $3 billion because someone managed to secure $500 million in marketing expense. Right? The difference now between what life used to be like is that the games industry has to adhere to budgets that are just enormous. And who has access to this other than some subsidiary of a giant oil-run, state-run organization? These are the budgets that we're looking at. These are the budgets for development. These are the budgets for marketing. And it has everything to do with this abundance of content. The games industry has become so rich in content that it's just become impossible to connect with audiences in a meaningful way. And that's a problem. Absolutely, it's a problem for game companies to reach the right user base. How do I, as a consumer, find the thing that's relevant to me when there is just so much noise in the marketplace? And the inevitable result, of course, is that companies underperform, right? And as a bellwether, which is not entirely unreasonable, when you look at the games industry and you divide them between publicly traded and privately held companies, 80% or so of them are publicly traded firms. And so that gives investors and shareholders and anyone else access to a lot of intimate data, a lot of earnings information that allows you to say, well, this title didn't work out, therefore this publisher is kind of weak, and so the overall category and sector is in decline. When we look at the US games makers, with some exception, you see there that game companies are having a hard time. With some exception, you see that the overall performance since the pandemic, when it was at its height, has now declined in a meaningful way. The same thing you could say here in Europe, with only CD Projekt, one of my personal favorites because of its comeback story. Yes. We'll talk about them in a second. But so every other major firm, including the Ubisoft that I mentioned, is vastly underperforming the average in the industry and in the region, giving everybody sort of the evidence they need to say, aha, see, it's a hula hoop after all. And the same thing then finally in Asia. Most recently, we saw some massive layoffs coming from NetEase, for instance. We've heard that story before. A lot of different companies are out there trying to figure out how to outperform the market. Only Konami managed to do so because of its success, of course, in the marketplace overall. Many of the main companies there have been receding. They've been taking investment money off the table, and it has a largely negative impact on the overall ecosystem. For instance, NetEase, which recently had a massive breakout hit with Marvel Rivals, a first-person shooter game, sort of Overwatch-like, but it's Spider-Man and a bunch of your superheroes allowing you to play. I've never seen this much absence among my students. They're all apparently working very hard, but I'm told this is what they're playing. And yet somehow we then get also the news that NetEase is removing a lot of its, is reallocating its cost structure to put it in corporate terms, and basically laying off a huge part of the team that's responsible for this particular title. And in my mind, that's fine, I guess. I mean, it's a pain that creatives get laid off. It's a sad thing, of course, all around. But the thinking behind it, I guess, kind of makes sense in a sense where if it's harder to afford things, even if you have success, you have to make some cuts. But is that really the way to go? Are we really investing in the long term, or are we making short-term cuts to kind of become less fuel efficient? And that, when I say that, what I mean, of course, is that in the absence of a NetEase investing more broadly, when a strategic investor like a publisher starts to take some of the money out of the market and say, we're not going to be investing, we're not going to take as much risk, we're going to actually reduce the number of deals and the average value of them, that then dries up the ability of the industry to innovate and to fuel and fund new ideas. One of the happy moments that came out of the pandemic in that sense was that the incredible momentum in the games industry was the entry of venture funding that didn't exist before, becoming this additional source of funding for small studios. You had a lot of sort of middle management out of Riot Games and a bunch of other studios that could very easily raise $5, $10, $20 million to see through their project. Those projects haven't really paid off by and large, and so now you see the exiting also of venture capital from the market. And so in addition to the NetEases that stop and withdraw their strategic capital, venture funding is also, while traditionally very friendly, they now also are taking their money out of the market. And that's a problem. And so to give you some numbers, of course, it's dropped from 4.5 to 0.8 billion. You see the deal size, the number of deals go from 380 to 114 over the same period. And so it's just much less activity. Sorry. There's much less activity that I don't want this guy to come back. Okay, we good? Okay. There's much less activity. And I end up wondering, he's going to come back. What are the mainstays? What are the moments where you have to? I told you. I'm just going to wait it out. I don't want to. I think this is. Do I get 3 strikes for this? Is that how that goes? You get to mess it up once, twice. After that, you just get. What did I do now? No, yes, I'm back. I'm back. All right, that's it. That's all the special effects I have. Be wary of the CEO that travels. Right before Jim Ryan, the former CEO of PlayStation, retired after 28 years of an incredible career. He ran around and take a bunch of pictures, and of course, that makes a lot of sense, but you have to be comfortable and careful a little bit. It's like when you start to see the most senior person in your organization show up at your studio, always ask the question, why are they here exactly? NetEase, similarly, you could see senior management traveling around when you talk to some of these people. I was in Paris recently, and people can tell what's coming next. Some of us have been in the industry long enough, and so beware of the visiting CEO, because what it ends up is that you get laid off. The job cuts, and these are just the reported ones over the last few years, have reached record highs. It's this record level of just people losing their job, which is an incredibly unfortunate thing. Not just for the US industry, not just for the European one, but globally, in that that's the creative talent that's now going to be very much discouraged to continue on, to very much discouraged to stay in this industry that already has so many of its challenges and issues. And overall, what you see then, which I think is probably the largest disservice to the consumer base, is that we're back to this risk-averse type of thinking where everybody starts to make a very similar game. So we have Ubisoft coming out with Assassin's Creed Shadows. Looks great. Will it do well? We'll see. We have Ghost of Yotei. And then finally, The Witcher 4. All of them have female protagonists with a sword slicing people up. Right? And so all of a sudden we have this increasingly uniform market where just like 5 years ago we had a lot of battle royale titles, we had a lot of shooter games, and it becomes this sort of red ocean in cheesy business terms where all of a sudden everybody is competing for the same audience with the same formulaic approach. And it raises the question like, okay, that sounds pretty bad. What's next? What's the good news? I can't with this guy. I'm just trying to like wrap my, I'm reasonably smart. I can't see through it. So the immediate response, post-election, and it's gotten so much worse since, the immediate response in November was, of course, let's increase tariffs. And the games industry, from a hardware perspective and from a development perspective, a large part of it comes from countries, is manufactured in places that are not the US, as so many other things. By increasing tariffs on just countries outright, it hugely disadvantages the games industry. And so the Consumer Technology Association did a report. Anywhere between 10, 20, 40% of tariffs have a hugely adverse impact on the games industry. It suggests an increase of $264 per console for an average user, an average US consumer. And I think that that's kind of a little bit telling in the fact that this is a very unfun type of administration. Of course, the retaliation and the struggle and the trade war that looms over this is like, it's very typical. So of course now China is having a big meeting and they're going to basically do the same. And so it creates a lot of stress and a lot of tension. We're already at this sort of moment of weakness, and suddenly now have all these grown men that don't play video games in suits deciding who else gets to play. And it's, of course, immediately palpable. If you look at how Nintendo makes its money, 40% of it comes from the US. Right as it announces the Switch 2, at the same moment that we see these tariffs looming, that's a big problem. All of a sudden now one of the most successful companies in the industry, one of the longest standing companies as a 130-year-old organization, now finds itself sort of on the business end. And it's just kind of the saddest thing. Like, why can't we have nice things? This is why we can't have nice things. And I can continue on what that means, but you can do the analysis. Like if we sell in previous cycles so many titles, so many copies, so many units with any kind of tariffs, that you start to see an immediate decline. The darkest colored one here is, of course, the worst. But overall, it hits the industry, and particularly the console segment, at a time when it's particularly fragile as we transition from one hardware generation to the next, and suddenly now we find ourselves having to also account for people that don't like video games. A general strategy that's widespread in the market right now is that large companies are taking what capital they have left, instead of putting it into marketing outright and basically paying Apple and other ecosystems to recruit people and acquire them, they are just buying companies that seem to be doing well and are somehow adjacent or similar to their own efforts. And so we see Playtika buying a company called Superplay, these casino-style mobile games. It doesn't really add to their share value, but it's an effort to grow inorganically. In a market that doesn't grow on its own, now suddenly we're just going to start consolidating and buying up other pieces so that we look bigger at least, if nothing else. The same thing happens then with the potential acquisition of Pokemon Go, the asset Pokemon Go from Niantic by Scopely for an alleged $3.5 billion. All of these components are basically ways to move assets around, hoping that combined we can be a little bit more robust and be a little bit more insulated from the tides as they change. And then finally, I think that one of the main strategies in the games industry has been to focus a little too much on a singular demographic. I have a 12-year-old. He likes Roblox. Of course, it's a fun game. It's a blocky game. It gives you a lot of unstructured freedom. There's a lot of questions to ask around this game as well, right? Not in the least because, on the one hand, we see the numbers go up and to the right up until its most recent quarter. And it raises an immediate alarm for a lot of companies that have been hoping and investing in this, saying like, oh, this is the big high mark. Maybe, we'll see, but any kind of company will go up and down. But perhaps this isn't the only bet that we can make. Perhaps there is a broader demographic that we can appeal to than just kids over and over again. This is one of the hardest categories to get into. It's one of the most difficult, most fraught with bad agents. This is not necessarily the most risk-averse approach. More broadly, we see, of course, a trend emerge, not just in the US, but everywhere else, where academics and parents and a lot of researchers come to the conclusion that maybe all those devices that we built with so much effort and diligence and aspiration may have an adverse effect. In fact, one of my colleagues at NYU, Jonathan Haidt, very popular, did an excellent job, I think, on his book overall. He doesn't understand two shits about games, but that's okay, that's a separate conversation. But he ends up having a really strong argument with regards to how do younger generations interact with social media, with new technologies, and how does that impact them in a positive or negative way. I think that besides the larger cultural conversation, is of course a terrible business model. Why would you engage yourself in this kind of category if you're a game maker? It's an incredibly difficult thing to do. More generally, if you compare the goodwill and the effort and the investment from some of these companies to build a robust and safe environment, you find very quickly that this is then a much harder thing to do. It's a matter of curiosity to me personally that Roblox per 100,000 users has only double the number of moderators compared to X and less than pretty much everybody else. If we think of this as a social space, if we think of this as a digital environment, I'm a little curious why we would have fewer people patrolling and have eyes on and moderating the interactions on, AKA a digital playground, and everything else is watched more closely. And part of the problem in my mind, and this is probably me as a Gen X just speaking freely, technology in my mind is always best met with skepticism. There's a movie where Matt Damon, Good Will Hunting, that's the name of it, sorry. And I come back to this so many times, but he has this moment where he meets a girl and it goes really well, and then he talks to his therapist, Robin Williams, and he says, right now everything's perfect. Right now we just met each other and we're getting together and we have this chemistry and we've never done the laundry together and we've never had to pay rent together and we never had to go to each other's parents and listen to their story. We are just at this perfect moment in our relationship where if we don't move from here, it will always be this idealized exchange. And in my mind, that's often how we think of technology, right? This perfect gizmo in the sky. I'm not adverse to technology personally. I love all the devices, but only ever to test them as tools and the things that they claim to be doing. And so if you go back in time a little bit and you look at the cinematographic interpretations of, say, virtual reality, very quickly do you find these trends to be oscillating and quite naive in some ways. This is Lawnmower Man, 1992. Basically the Lawnmower Man, the guy mowing his lawn, was going to become this much more powerful, this intellectually savvy, this enabled person because you put him in his chair and put on some goggles, and now suddenly it would open his mind, right? That was the promise of VR. Jessica Fletcher, I'm not saying that I have this because I watched the show, but that's exactly why. It's a really good show. This is a whole episode of her playing in VR, and it's this fantastic just manifestation, right? It's like you could extend yourself into these realities and interact in the same way that we are all doing here. In Disclosure, we see Michael Douglas, finding secret files about some conspiracy, and he's accessing this vast library of very well-organized information, and then of course, in the back you see this bad agent coming to get him as this virtual representation of his nemesis. But so it's a very elaborate way of speaking of, with regards to virtual reality, its potential and what it would mean to us. And of course, finally, we have Johnny Mnemonic, pre-Matrix. He was already cool then, he only got cooler since. And it was about accessing this vast new universe, where this clean, wholesome place where we could go and be better versions of ourselves. Yeah, not so much. This is the New York skeptic in me, but you see this stuff day to day. Not so much this particular, but the applications of technology and the way people behave and how people interpret and use it in their day-to-day life. And it makes then for me always a bit of a disappointment. After all of this money invested, how far did we come? How far have we come really as an industry when some of the participants, in particular Sony, which came out very early with the PlayStation VR, has all but stopped talking about it, right? It's been out there, it's doing well, but it's not really breaking any kind of disruptive new ground. Of course, Mark figured out by now that it's not really supposed to be this geeky gadget. It has to be this fashion thing. You have to make it aspirational. You can see this in his own personal glow up in that sense. All of a sudden, he's this jiu-jitsu stud muffin that is now selling you these $300 glasses that are going to open your world. I don't know. It's a very different read with regards to how we started and where we are now. But if you spend about $60 billion, yeah, fine, we can get there, right? This kind of investment where the return on all of the money that he spent on Reality Labs and compared to what he sank into it just doesn't really match up. And the underlying narrative, very quickly then, if you listen to its CTO, is the fact that they're not really trying to think first about what's coolest for you. What they're trying to figure out is like, how do we secure our future as a company? What product category can we control completely from the ground up so that unlike mobile phones, where Apple made us suffer through this IDFA change and all of a sudden we had to get off platform there, how do we figure out to define this new garden where we can control all of the ins and outs? Here's another one, the metaverse. I struggle always to visualize this, but it's this magical place of interconnected 3D environments, all built by separate companies that are on the basis of economics, all compete with each other, but somehow find some kumbaya moment where they all find this interconnected reality, where they now become this utility, this communal space. I have a hard time believing that, but if nothing else, it borrows very heavily from narratives that we've heard before. When the TV became this mass medium back in the 50s, one of the narrative strands was, we're going to have access to these professors that are going to teach the masses. Suddenly now, because we can broadcast a signal and an image and a sound, we can make it available to anyone to get this incredible education. We're going to open everybody's mind. What we got is different, right? What we got, and I was a fan, I'm not putting that out here. I am just there with the rest of us. But it's a matter of like the ambition is always one thing and the reality, the final product is always something else. Another technology, Web3, I'm a fan. I like the idea of moving away from centralized organization where one company makes 1 million copies and sells them to an audience. Stage 2, the middle one here, is a network-based approach where we all play together, where we can all create things together, where we can share things through this network of connections and nodes and relationships. So an idea around decentralized organization where we don't really need anything in between us. There's no centralized owner of any of this, but we can all set up our own nodes and connect. I like that idea so much. But of course, that doesn't happen because money doesn't flow that way, right? Most of the decentralization effort around Web3 has resulted in a re-centralization of capital. And what that means is we have a few high-end, very expensive products that finally rolled out, that finally gave shape to what could Web3 gaming look like. And it's games like off the grid, which in and of themselves aren't bad gameplay experiences. They just don't make a strong case for also having to buy digital currency and trade in it and own assets in it. It's a fun game, but did it really need all this extra tech associated with it? Illuvium, same thing, another one of these high-end AAA releases. Never mind that there is a lot of fuel inefficiency in the back where the game runs really hot, requires a lot of processing power, but it ends up being this moment of like, okay, so all of this investment got us only this? That's a little disappointing. And then most recently, I guess, the AI moment that stands with me more recently is, very simply put, after all the money spent and after all of the effort and the 500 billion that we're all going to allocate to this, what is actually the question that we're trying to solve here, right? What is it that we can learn from this conversation where on the one hand we see these massive budgets and on the other hand we see people allegedly build something of similar quality or at least of competitive quality that are doing it at a fraction. And Elon Musk then has, of course, immediately answered his own question in that regard. Sorry. Elon Musk has answered this question on his own in that he ends up spending a lot of money to sort of have a cheat code in hand, right? One of my favorite recent anecdotes about Elon was that he got busted. He claimed to be this incredible player of Path of Exile, and it turns out he just paid someone to play it because when he actually played it in front of a live streaming camera, it turns out he can't play it at all. He doesn't really know it. He makes a lot of amateur decisions in the game. It's okay, but it's kind of true that if you show me what you play, it tells me who you are. And so the money flows, fondly, of course. Lots of billions go into this sector. I still struggle to find somewhat of a use case. It's coming. I do believe that in the larger set of questions that games companies have today, we end up having to answer like, okay, how do we make things more efficiently? Is it possible to give players more autonomy? Can we create agency in some ways with regards to user-generated content, yes or no? And so Sony, this was, I think, just this morning, apparently has been working on this AI version of Alloy, one of their biggest franchises, Horizon Zero Dawn, where you can interact and have a conversation. So it's sort of a skinned version of the character that everybody knows that you can now talk to as a one-on-one person. I like that idea, but is that a consumer demand? Is that a future? We'll see. And so the takeaway from this section then is very simply put that technology tends to obfuscate and create a lot of noise, and it doesn't really necessarily add a lot of added value. In this case, I see technology as sort of this ebb and flow. Things come and go over time. We were very excited about the microprocessing chip. We were very excited about VR in the 90s. We're very excited about AI today. And it's always worth asking, like, is this really going to help us? And how will it help us? How will this improve everything? When I see then, for instance, the people that dominate the conversation, the leaders in that space, immediately bending the knee to a new administration, I find that, again, from a business perspective, worrying, right? It's if, here's Mark again, if they're willing so quickly to make a very clear political standpoint, if they're willing to immediately donate, if they're willing to just sit there and listen to some of this, as business owners, as the largest tech companies in the world, what does that mean for the rest of us? What does it mean when Jeff Bezos says, yeah, we're not doing it anymore. From now on, this is our agenda. From now on, this is how we speak. If that's how they're willing to deal with fact-checking and newspaper reporting, what does that mean for games? And it probably means that you're going to end up with a bunch of people dominating and setting the tone for the rest of us. And this is where then I agree with Elon and friends. This is one of his buddies, founder of Dogecoin, saying, look, gamers have always been anti-nonsense. They've always seen through it. The fundamental fallacy, of course, in this statement is that what they fail to realize is that the outsiders and the bullshit is them. So, what now? How do I bring this all back together so in a way that we can get up and get back to life? Because that sounds pretty depressing. I've given you a lot of fire and brimstone. But I'm not standing here because the short term matters. I'm standing here because the long term matters. If we look at the industry over an extended period of time, if we look at the last 50 years of the games industry, since the 70s, we can identify a very distinct and recurrent pattern in how it operates, functions, and changes. And so over the years, you see then an oscillation between two different phases of innovation. On the one hand, we have periods of content innovation, where new technology and new ways of thinking about making games changes dramatically the kinds of games that we play, the kinds of games that we produce. At the same time, we also look at the games industry very differently because now suddenly we have Super Mario on the NES. Suddenly now we have this incredible experience where things are three-dimensional. Suddenly things are connected, and we have never been able to play with these new technologies in a way that makes sense to us. Play so often then is the entry point for new technologies, and that's how things get popularized. Those moments are alternating with periods of distribution innovation. We see periods of 8, 9, 10 years where all of a sudden, as we reach the moment in the market where things are just saturated, where everybody is doing mostly the same stuff, all of a sudden distribution becomes far more important. And by distribution innovation, I really mean different pricing mechanisms, different distribution channels, different storefronts, different ways to reach audiences, right? It's not just about making more spectacular things. It's very much about building things and that are underneath all of it. Like, how do we think creatively about the mechanisms that bring our content to market? And so I'll run you through a few examples of what that looks like. Back in the day when Atari came out, and you will have noticed some of the QR codes. Those are for you to scan if you want to read more. Atari back in the day was, of course, a very successful business, but it was built along this logic of industrial economies of scale. We build more arcades, and that's how we make more money. And then as we go into the console business, we do the same thing. And so what that resulted in was, of course, on the one hand, a great new way to play, something really novel and that we haven't seen before. At the same time, Atari also kind of took it a little too far. All of a sudden now we had this very cluttered market with a lot of undifferentiated content, and now it's all of a sudden very sad and kind of just boring to be in that space. And of course, the quality assurance, the quality control went out the window as Atari scaled for, and grew very quickly, growing from only a few hundred people to 10,000 people over the course of a period of 2 years. The first thing to go is quality, and what happens, of course, is that now suddenly people don't want to spend money anymore. And again, that same narrative, like, oh, the games industry is like a toy, the fad has reached its end, and suddenly now we are confronted with E.T. in 1983, and a whole bunch of parents went out and bought it, and nobody liked it, and the whole thing tanked. And it quite literally evaporated 80% of the value of the US games market. This is followed then by some really interesting distribution innovations, right? As the content innovation reaches its zenith and starts to decline, games industry makers, the games industry companies start to think much more creatively about, like, well, what's actually fun here? How do we bring this back to life? How do we resuscitate this? And Nintendo famously instilled, of course, incredible deep nostalgia around Mario and all that, but really it comes down to its distribution approach. Nintendo instilled with developers this idea that they had to buy in. They had to only send their most high-quality games, their best titles. They had to be part of the marketing, and they had to invest in bringing the ecosystem to life. They also made it so that retailers were very strict about, who had been very strict since the collapse of the industry, said, like, look, there's no expense for you. So they would place Nintendo systems at retail for free. And finally, they created things like a helpline and a magazine for consumers so that people would actually see what they could buy before they spent their money. And so by attacking those three levels with regards to how to publish interesting, fun games to play, they weren't so much making more spectacular games. They weren't so much making things that were more beautiful or somehow rousing in some way. What they were doing is like getting back to what actually mattered in the industry. Another example of that for me is also Doom. Very excited about Doom Dark Ages coming out. I grew up with this one. And it's a title that was popular not just because it was just fun to play. It was, in fact, actually deeply unpopular because it was one of those shooter games where everybody was worried that now everybody was going to be a maniac. What made Doom and its software so popular is the fact that they gave most of their source code away for free on the internet, allowing people to make level packs and games and extensions of the game, user-generated content before it was cool, right? And that allowed it to just permeate society at large, and anybody with a computer and an online connection could make things. And so here too, it's like, was the game great? Yes. But what really made it sing was the fact that they figured out this distribution model. So as the industry then reestablishes itself, you start to see people that come in and say, you know what? That works out well for us. We're going to enter the market. We're going to start acquiring and pursue economies of scales again. In this context, Electronic Arts is a big, you could argue, good or bad agent, but it's a very characteristic company in that it very quickly racked up dozens of studios and hundreds of titles under its ownership. And that became its model. The same thing happened to Hasbro at the time. Right before the dot-com bust, you see Hasbro running into this idea that, hey, you know what, we have all this access to retail. If we bring together a bunch of publishers under our umbrella, we already have the distribution thing solved. We can just pursue economies of scale. And of course, just like Atari, the problem that Hasbro ran into, among other things at the time, was the fact that they could not manage the quality control very well because the organization was growing so quickly. That worked out fine for as long as it ended up being a moment of just upward swing. Everybody was doing well, the industry was growing. The second the internet bubble popped, it was done, and they had to sell it off. This follows then, of course, a new period of time. Oh, there's my Club Penguin. It ends up not just being about new content so much as it is, how do we bring back the value? And you see then, for instance, World of Warcraft right? A game that's been around for a little bit suddenly comes up with this new subscription model. Suddenly they figure out, you know what we could do? We could build this game and we could put it in people's hands in a way that we haven't had before. It didn't really exist. There was, of course, EverQuest, but they made it accessible to a mass market. What Blizzard, the studio that ultimately became part of the larger entity, did so well was take existing popular phenomenon, existing popular gameplay, and made it accessible to a mass audience. I could talk about Steam for hours. I'll say this, Steam was really just the front end of Valve, a publisher, which had made a game with Sierra Online, and as the game, Half-Life, finally reached market, they realized that in order to send patches and updates, they really needed something on the front of it. Valve was an incredible, continues to be one of the most successful companies in the industry. What they figured out is like how to improve distribution. And I remember this in 2004, that's around the year most of this happened. All of a sudden you had these companies coming up with this idea that you could send out new patches and updates, expansions, new level packs, etc., digitally. And so now you could reach a much broader audience and continue to engage them in some way. Better still, you could now offer that same capability to third parties. Suddenly you see then Steam become this massive platform, their first real digital storefront, long before it was cool in the sense of Spotify, long before Netflix really got all the accolades that it deserves. Steam was already doing that. Just straight up distribution innovation. And of course, that then hits this momentum that you're probably most familiar with. The last 10 years, you see this incredible spending. Everybody's excited about games. Games are now the norm. It's destigmatized. And of course, immediately people and companies resort to acquisitions. Take-Two ultimately acquired Zynga for $13 billion. When it went IPO, Zynga was worth $1 billion. And so by not moving earlier, by slowly moving into this new model, they spent 13 times as much as they perhaps could have. The same thing for Activision Blizzard. A $70 billion acquisition. It was a really interesting moment in my mind. I still think that was a smart acquisition, but who among us has $70 billion to spend on Bobby Kotick, I guess? So it ends up being very much, this moment again where we're not really innovating in terms of content so much as we are seeing most of the momentum driven by large companies that are very acquisitive in nature, and they're trying to consolidate their market power. And now that the industry is turning again, we start to see the very beginning of new models. What's going to be the next decade in gaming is not going to be more of this misery. I believe that the industry is reaching a moment of transition. It's evolving into its next stage. It's evolving into its next era of distribution. And the early indicators of that are, for instance, the Mario movie. Why? Why do we have a Mario movie? And then why do we all go and watch it when it really has no story that's interesting at all? And yet, it generated $1.4 billion at box office. And the answer is because it's fun. Because Nintendo knows exactly, like, you know what, people will watch this. It's crazy. We're going to go to every single level. We're going to have all these little, these little tells in the movie that are going to remind people that have played the game that Mario Kart is cool and that there's all this sort of lore around it. I don't need to know about Mario's dad. I think that that's a weird thing to know. But it's a narrative vehicle that makes it possible. And so me and my kid, we've watched it several times. It's an incredibly popular thing. And it leads a lot of other game companies to realize that IP is exactly that. Like, we can expand the universe. The narrative economy is too limited only in this particular environment. Epic does this well too, of course. Fortnite, both in its sort of offering and its cross-pollination with other brands. A lot of superheroes in there. But they do a really good job integrating non-endemic brands, things that are outside of the games industry, into their game, as well as offering as a platform the ability through digital storefronts and publish anywhere. These initiatives where you as a small studio can actually reach a lot of different platforms through their platform. And I think that that's an interesting one, right? Again, whether that's on the front end in terms of expanding your IP or whether that's on the back end in terms of how do we reach more customers at different price points, that's where I think the next decade will go. And so I'll summarize it in 3 different things. The first is low tech. The future of the games industry, I believe, at least in the immediate few years, will be in a space, in a place, in a surrounding where all of that expensive gear that we've been buying is going to have to take a back seat. Immediately obvious and sort of most tangible in that context, like the console industry is doing fine. PlayStation had the best quarter just yet, but they're all building handhelds. Right? We're not sure yet what the Microsoft one looks like, but here we have in short order a few of them. Switch 2 is just announced, PlayStation Portal, selling like hotcakes. What this does is a few things. One of them is of course, a lower price point. The basic PlayStation Pro now costs $700. If you really want to get the full kit, it's close to $1,000. The plastic stand that it sits on is $40 and it's sold separately. So you know that might work for some of you, but probably not for most of us. And so the PlayStation Portal, which is a much lower price point, also allows you to stream games directly with cloud gaming, and suddenly becomes this unlock where I can totally play this in bed without waking up my wife, and I still get to play all those cool games. I don't have to compete with the 3-year-old in the family room over who gets to control the TV. Love Peppa Pig, but I got to play some games too sometime. And so it allows not just a lower price point, but it also gives you an opportunity to kind of break some of these existing play patterns. Right? It's the kind of thinking that I think will be massively interesting. And it's, of course, and I don't want to ride Nintendo too hard here, but that's where the Switch was so evolutionary, right? It was this sort of lower powered device, but it did so well, changed how we played. And that's not the only way that we think about this. You see this increase among developers, especially smaller shops, that are making that decision. On the one hand, you have the large, powerful ecosystems, and then there is browser-based gaming. And after a steady decline for several years, we now start to see a renaissance of sorts where small shops, innovative little creative workers that are thinking about how to get their game to market, they're relying on different platforms for distribution. And if you really want to take it to the end, in my mind, we can't only think of play manifested in video games. There's also board games. There's in fact a resurgence in board game sales where large companies, whether that's the Hasbros and Mattels of the world, or whether that's the Asmodees, which is about to be spun off from Embracer, those are incredibly, not just valuable companies, they're doing incredibly well just selling dice and paper and cards and little pawns that you can click around. And so in my mind, it's like this is where then the future of the games industry might draw from in a way that nobody's really bringing this up, right? What we're obsessing about is the new tech, when the low tech is really one of the most innovative and driving forces behind it. In LA, you have something called the LA Chess Club. Yeah, it's kind of chess and kind of dating, sure. But then, how many times do you go see a sports event with your son? How many times do you go and play something just to be with some other person, with some other group of people? And so play sits at the center of that. And it's, in some ways in my mind, that the low-tech aspects of all of these examples is that it allows people to reconnect with each other. And it's a classic for a reason, obviously, right? If you look at the chess club membership up and to the right, why is that? Isn't that a totally old game? Shouldn't we be playing other things now? Isn't tech better? Where's the tech version of chess? And I think it plugs into a larger phenomenon where as people age, like they come back to their old habits. What matters to them most is fun. You see, particularly with Lego, just to throw in another example, adult fans of Lego, AFOLs, are people like me that can totally spend $1,000 on a Millennium Falcon and not think about it twice, because that's my entire childhood in a box that I'm going to spend 3 weekends putting together, right? And if that's too much indoors, things like pickleball, where did that come from, right? But it's super popular. And so all of a sudden, we start to amass a bunch of different examples of low-tech, new phenomena, new manifestations of play that we hadn't really considered, that doesn't really make sense in the logic of tech and finance, but that are incredibly valuable and very much enjoyed by a growing number of people. The second piece of it is lowbrow. By lowbrow, I don't mean, it's not up to snuff culturally. By lowbrow, I mean it's accessible. It just fit the narrative a little better. Lowbrow, in this sense, means like in the early 2000s, what you see so much is an incredible focus and sort of a myopic moment where everybody's focusing on the same demographic. Everybody's making the same games for the same audience. It's a little bit about what's happening now. And it is a moment, it's only a matter of time before that breaks open. Because by doing that, of course, what you do is like you cut out half of your audience. There's no reason to believe that women don't like to play games. Turns out, who knew? And so, in fact, since then, the games industry has been on the bettering hand. They've improved a lot. You start to see then that the number of women in game organizations with decision-making powers, not just sort of sitting around, interning is like people in positions of power inside of creative shops. When you compare music, film, and games, games now is the largest one with 26%. I think that's very encouraging. And if we're talking demographics, of course, there is a much broader range here too. I've mentioned it a few times now, but it's as the generation that grows up with games suddenly finds themselves at a place where like, hey, I have specific needs, I have specific preferences, you start to see this change on a demographic level. This is not a fad, this is not a hula hoop, this is millions of people as they age say, look, I grew up with this, I want to play these games. You see the amount of time that older generations, meaning 40 and up, start to play increasing a number of hours every week. And they end up becoming a much more viable demographic and audience for game makers. At the same time, like women 15 years ago, nobody's really making games for them just yet. This isn't really a developed one yet. So I believe that providing access to this new consumer demographic will actually be useful over time. We're going to make it. I have 43 slides left, so let's go. And so to talk more about that specific topic, you should come to our talk later. We're doing a panel. It'll be a lot of fun. I like that category very much, and so anybody interested should join. One of the examples here, if that seems a little far-fetched and abstract, when you look at a game like Wargaming that makes World of Tanks, a very serious Russian game-making company based in Cyprus that makes these sort of slow shooter games with like ultra-realistic tanks. I've worked with them for years. They're brilliant in some ways. They discovered that it's a very bimodal audience breakout where you have, of course, the young players that are trying to win and beat and be always sort of on top of the rankings. And then there is this age demographic that is a little older and maybe doesn't perform as well and maybe doesn't get all the rewards in the game, but they have the best time. And so maybe winning isn't everything. Maybe it isn't just about this one particular audience as it goes. Maybe it's about creating game and play experiences for a broader variety and diversity of people. And the last piece of it then is low cost. This works really well if we don't really have to pay for it, right? As the economy starts to turn, as recession becomes increasingly more obvious and imminent in some ways, what we start to see is that games can't really continue down this road. They can't afford to look. This is such a good example of an article in the New York Times. The way to think about that is like, how do we now use some existing revenue models that we haven't seen before? And one that immediately comes to mind is the fact that if you compare the amount of time, the share of time on social media to gaming is roughly in the same ballpark, right? It's 19 versus 13%, but the spending among advertisers on the former and the latter is 10x different. And so in other words, it might actually be time for brands and advertisers to think a little bit differently. It might actually be time for developers to think a little bit differently about how can we source in a natural sort of organic way a bunch of new partners that are going to help us build these creative visions and do it in such a way that doesn't immediately tether us to large tech platforms. And so one immediate example is Genshin Impact. Incredibly successful. That one is already doing it. That one is already very deliberately putting ads in there, making billions of dollars, but that moment eventually subsides. As the momentum leaves it a little bit, you end up realizing like, hey, how do we offset direct revenue and how can we build some indirect revenue into the pipe? The larger ecosystem, and I like to think of this not just as incidental case studies or examples, but is there some observable trend at a large macro scale that would validate some of this? And if you identify and basically label game companies and the companies active in gaming according to what they do, suddenly you start to see a pattern. So of course we have sort of your endemic game companies, but then very closely adjacent you see consumer electronics companies as well, and they make a lot of sense. I'm worried now. It ends up being a category of companies that have worked together for a long time. Then we see, of course, the tech platforms, and that tends to be historically sort of the overall ecosystem that we define as the games industry. But then in recent years, you see this emergence of companies that are non-endemic to the games industry. These companies don't actually make games. They realize that gaming is an incredible piece of the pie for them. That's how they attract users. It's how they convince subscribers. It's how they access a much broader, much more engaged audience that is perhaps tired of traditional channels and perhaps a little, wilded out by social media. And so that overall chart then looks something like this, where if we look a little bit more closely to what the universe looks like in which we as game makers and investors operate, it is much more diverse, it has a lot more color to it. And so in sheer numbers, it's roughly 222 versus 37 billion, $38 billion overall. That I expect only to grow. The example here, very simply put and very quickly, is for instance, Elf Beauty. Not a user myself, but it's very popular. Maybe I should, I don't know. You know, that would help. You see here some of these initial non-endemic companies, like a makeup company that, you know, if you're L'Oreal, you shouldn't worry about this. And suddenly they activate in Roblox. And suddenly that is some way for them to build their user base and get really popular among a huge fan base. You know, they get massive amounts of downloads and impressions. And now suddenly they're a formidable competitor to the incumbents in the makeup space. And so by leaning into the game space, by leaning into these new audiences, they're able to compete with the incumbents in their own category, something that was never possible before. And it's not just beauty. If you look at it across apparel and a bunch of other brands, increasingly mobile strategies are played out, and it ends up being digital environments and interactive entertainment that is much more valuable and much more the front of their, the tip of their spear in marketing. Here's some numbers. And what I want to leave you now with, you can look up that later, is this conversation where not too long ago, Elon Musk had, you know, he constantly has things to say. I feel like this year is really his year, and not for the better. You know, here's a person that lies about path of exile, that pretends to be this incredible player. He wants to get the clout. He wants to get, you know, the credibility that it gives you. If you've actually played these games, you're one of the gamers, if you've really been part of it. And you know this to be true. You connect with people instantly. I have 4 words for Elon too. And I'll give them to you in a second, which is very simply put, games have been under a lot of stress the last few years. The games industry has been in decline. There's a lot of fire and brimstone that comes at us. But I believe that that's really just a false narrative. I think that conventional wisdom is too much based on the agenda and the thinking and the logic of tech firms and financial advisors and investors. What it really means to me is that the games industry is now back in the hands of the people that actually play the games, the people that actually make the games. And so while there might be a strong tendency to overlook all this and say, it's all on fire and it's all going to be the end of the world, we've been here before. If nothing else, this pendulum swing that I've showed you should tell you that there is actually a lot of hope and promise right around the corner. And so what Elon doesn't get, and my statement to him would be, Elon is an idiot. I don't need him to make games great. Games were always great. My name is Joost. Thank you for your time. All right. I guess we have 90 seconds for some questions. Oh, I'll start with the $100 question. Will GTA course correct the industry business-wise? Will it punch through the $100 glass ceiling for AAA games? Or is this a one-of-a-kind phenomenon? The $100 price point for AAA games is an inevitability on the one hand, in that inflation and the cost of development has led to a moment where a $70 game doesn't really catch and capture the value of the investment so much. And so they will likely push as hard as they can. I know from some of the market signals that I get that indeed Rockstar and Take-Two is very actively looking into this. Will they do it for the base game? I don't think so, but there will certainly be a $100 or $200 version of the game for the fans. The bifurcation in the market on the high end and the low end will continue, and for a AAA like GTA 6, it doesn't make any sense to not do that. Who are the smart people in the space? Obviously me, but you know, the thing for venture capital and entertainment really comes down to like go with strategic investors, like publishers that do it, that can help you depending on the size and the state of your company and your project, as well as venture firms that focus very deliberately on it, have the team, have the knowledge base to actually help you get to the next thing. And so the shakeout that we've seen in venture capital is actually a benefit. You know much better who your allies are today. Thank you for your time.